Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is author, historian, Professor Michael Vorenberg. I will tell you all about Professor Vorenberg in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment we exert toward others. When you do it from a leadership position, as you will note from Professor Vorenberg today, who's going to share stories of Abraham Lincoln, you do it with bringing people together, common cause. And I can't think of a greater cause than saving a union. Michael Vorenberg, welcome to Grace Under Pressure.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me, John, and I appreciate it. And I very much enjoy the theme of your show, and it certainly relates to the book I've just written. So thank you again for having me on.
Great. And that book you just have written is called Lincoln's Peace: The Struggle to End the American Civil War. Now, you are a noted historian. You are the author of Final Freedom, The Civil War, the Abolition of Slavery, and the 13th Amendment. And not only was that a finalist for a major prize, it was a basis for the Steven Spielberg epic, Lincoln. So what an honor to have you. You are a professor at Brown University, and your writings have been everywhere from the New York Times, Politico, and the Washington Post. Professor Vorenberg, thank you for coming on the show today. Welcome.
Well, thank you again for having me. Yes.
Good. I want to end open with a question that's kind of a fanboy type thing. And it's, you're a noted historian, and your last book, as I mentioned, was a source for Steven Spielberg's film Lincoln. What was your reaction to seeing Daniel Day-Lewis play Lincoln? Did it resonate with you, and how?
Well, I think Daniel Day-Lewis did a magnificent job. There are really two things that I will always remember about the film. One is Daniel Day-Lewis's performance, which I think he completely nailed. And I don't know how, of course, we don't really know exactly what Lincoln sounded like, but it's so believable. It's just fantastic. But the other thing that I think is so striking is the screenplay. I don't want to take anything away from Steven Spielberg, the director, or from others. But because I knew the story that's told in that film, the story especially focuses on the passage of what would become the 13th Amendment through Congress. I had written about this in a book, and when the screenwriter, Tony Kushner, went to write the screenplay, he relied on a number of sources, but because my book was directly on this topic, he used my book quite a bit for the stuff around Congress. And I think it's a very hard thing to tell a story of Congress and the passage of legislation as a Hollywood film, right? And so the ability to do that, and to do it so well, and to make it so enlivened, and to really bring you there and make you care, I really was quite struck. I mean, I was trying to do this as an author, but my book was fairly academic. I didn't have to worry about ticket sales or anything like that. And so I was really, I really applaud Tony Kushner, the screenwriter there. But yes, back to Daniel Day-Lewis. It's absolutely fabulous performance.
And it should be noted that Tony Kushner, a noted author himself and playwright, endorsed your new book, The Lincoln's Peace. So now it's about the struggle to end the Civil War. And I'm an amateur historian, and even I know that the Civil War ended on April 9th, 1865 in Appomattox, when General Lee and General Grant met and signed the peace treaty. So why the book?
Right. No, it's a perfectly good question. And, that is a great question to begin with. So, and I'm really happy you said the date, April 9, 1865, because, 1865, because that date is fixed in memory as a point where the war ends. And then I guess afterwards comes peace. And like you, I certainly accepted that date. I grew up, in the United States, so which means I took American history in school, and there were images of the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on that day of Lee and Grant. It's such a famous image, right? And by the way, it's shown in the film Lincoln. It's a short scene there. That scene of you don't see the actual surrender, but you see the two generals sort of acknowledging each other, and the camera goes to Appomattox. So it is one of these legendary moments in American history.
Mm-hmm.
And I was perfectly satisfied with that as an endpoint, even though I knew, because I teach the American Civil War, I knew that after that moment, there are still some Confederate armies in the field. Jefferson Davis is still at large. Davis was the president of the Confederacy. He had not been captured. He had not surrendered. I knew these things, but I was perfectly willing when I taught my classes to say Appomattox as shorthand for the end of the war. But then what happened is I learned that a number of things. One is I learned just how extensive events were after April 9, 1865, how many events there were that were war, not just warlike, but were actual war. I learned that the country remained in a state of war legally for years. And then I learned, this was the kind of turning point for me, that a proclamation given by President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, 16 months after that day of surrender at Appomattox, was the official legal end of the war. So that proclamation is August 20, 1866. And Johnson declares that the insurrection is at an end. I kind of knew that. I didn't think much of it. But then I realized, because of these documents I discovered, that this was actually the official end, that the Supreme Court had even affirmed that as the end point. And so that really intrigued me. I didn't end up really diving in and writing a book for another 10 years. I planted the seed of doubt, if you will, about April 9. So that's how we come to the book.
Right. Well, you open the book with an interesting anecdote that from I believe someone in the military, or Lewis Grant, who was looking and examining a petition for survivor benefits or war benefits, and that was dated in 1865 or 1867. So he was claiming, or his family was claiming him as a Civil War veteran. So that piqued your curiosity, and tell us that story, please. So.
Right. So when I mentioned earlier that I came across some papers that really made me realize that things were more complicated, these are the papers. And it was really by accident that I came across them. I was working on an entirely different project, and I was in the National Archives, and the wrong box appeared. They brought me the wrong box. So I started going through the box while I waited for the right box to appear. And in there is this report written by Lewis Grant. The report was written in around 1890. But it was, and Lewis Grant, who bears no relation to Ulysses Grant, although he was a fan of Ulysses Grant. So Lewis Grant had been an officer in the U.S. Civil War. He was there at Appomattox at the surrender. By 1890, he's in the War Department as an assistant secretary of war. And what has happened is that a case has landed on his desk. As you say, it's a pension case. And this soldier is asking for benefits. And he had not joined the U.S. Army until early 1866. And he's asking for a war pension. And Lewis Grant, reviewing this pension, is obviously very confused, as I would be, or you might be. Somebody who signs up in early 66 is signing up after the war is over. They can hardly ask for a war benefit. But then it turns out Lewis Grant does some digging, and he realizes that the war officially goes on well beyond the Appomattox surrender. And so he took all these notes and he wrote this report, and all of these notes in the report are in this big file that I found and just was fascinated by. And so that's the anecdote that begins the book, is essentially realizing that this man more than 100 years ago, Lewis Grant, had undergone his own sort of journey, if you will, to try to find the end of the Civil War, which he thought he knew because he was there. He was there at Appomattox, but then he learns he's wrong. And so
Right.
I'm basically then embarking on a similar journey to find the end.
Now, it's a great story, and I want to focus a bit on the guerrilla actions that I knew about, and they have been reported and part of our history. Did Grant know that there would be continual skirmishes? What was the perception of the Union Army after Appomattox? What was the attitude or posture, shall I say?
So when the surrender happens on April 9th, 1865, there simultaneously there is a great deal of guerrilla activity going on in the West. And when I say the West, there are many Wests to talk about. So really the West I'm talking about is Arkansas, Kansas, Missouri, that area where there has been guerrilla activity since actually even before the Civil War, if we think about bloody Kansas in the 1850s. So there's been a lot of guerrilla activity there all along. On one hand, I think that Ulysses Grant and others in the U.S. Army hoped that when Robert E. Lee surrendered, because he was so famous and his army so famous, that others would follow his lead. I think that that was a hope. But Grant was a realist, and he knew the West well. That's where he was for most of the beginning of the war. And so he knew that another part of it knew that this could be the case. And if there really was no doubt by April 10th. So April 9th is the surrender. I'll tell this story. On April 10, the day after, Grant rides out from his headquarters, not from his headquarters, but from where the surrender took place. And he meets with Lee. And this time when they meet, it's just the two of them. And they're both on horseback and they speak to each other. By contrast, the day before, in the parlor of the Wilmer McLean house, there's many people around to witness and to listen to what's being said. But in this instance, we have only Grant's memoirs of what happened. And this is what happens at the meeting. Grant asks Robert E. Lee to appeal to Jefferson Davis and ask Davis to surrender all Confederate troops, because that's something that Davis can do, and only Davis can do, because Davis is the president of the Confederacy and the commander-in-chief. And Robert E. Lee says, no, he won't do that because he is Lee's inferior and it's not his place to do that. And I think Grant is disappointed by this. I know he is. And then Lee says something remarkable, which speaks to your question directly. He says, I suspect that it may take your forces, meaning the U.S. Army, it may take your forces 3 or 4 years, marching back and forth across the continent before you have put down this rebellion. In other words, Lee is acknowledging that there are insurgencies, or that's the modern word, or guerrilla warfare all over the place. And Grant does not contradict him. Grant says, yes, I just hope that, that this does not go on too long. So both of our primary actors understood that this lay ahead.
That's a fascinating story, and I think it's illustrative because a theme of your book is that peace does not come when the shooting starts or stops, but peace is made, and that is the whole struggle. And what was so? I mean, it was as much effort to have peace as it was to struggle. At least fewer people were killed. So what possessed you to explore that making of peace?
So I was a couple of things. One is that, as you say, peace is made. And I should say that when I talk about the kernel of the book being set more than 20 years ago, that doesn't mean I started working on that, but there were a couple of things going on. If you go back to 2003, right, one of these issues is that President George W. Bush, after the invasion of Iraq, declares that combat operations are over. He basically is saying that the war is over, that we're now moving towards occupation. And so it struck me then, can a president sort of declare a war over? Because this is a very different kind of war. That was in 2003. But in some ways, the Civil War was actually more like that kind of war in some ways than a traditional war. Why? Because the Confederacy was not a legitimate nation in the eyes of the United States. The United States could not settle a peace treaty with the Confederacy because the United States did not recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation. It could not do so because it said that secession was unconstitutional. So it could not recognize the Confederacy as a nation. Therefore, in the Constitution, it talks about how to make peace, but all it talks about is how to make peace between two nations. And there, the Congress and the president, well, the Congress is really the key player. But here, therefore, how do you make peace? How do you make peace with an enemy that is not recognized as legitimate? And that's sort of what the US was doing when it was invading Iraq and Afghanistan and dealing with insurrectionaries or the Taliban. And so how do you do that? And that's really what struck me as interesting. There's a major figure in my book whose name is Richard Henry Dana. And Dana is onto this right away. And the day after Appomattox in Boston, which is where Dana is from, there's all these celebrations in the streets of Boston and other northern cities. And prominent people give speeches, including Richard Henry Dana. And Dana says to the gathered throng, he says, peace was not made yesterday. Peace was not made.
Right.
It really rains on the parade, but he's onto it because he understands that the only way peace is going to come is through a process,
Right. And there was something that, as I was reading your book, I remember a quote. It ends with, the great, I'm blanking on his name, the historian who did the Civil War epic.
Ken Burns.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
So I did see it 3 times. If I can't remember Mr. Burns.
That's a lot of hours to spend watching.
Yeah.
But yes,
And even worse, he's from Ann Arbor, where I am too, and speaking to you. So shame on me. But anyway, there's a quote from a Southerner that confronting a Northern, and perhaps in Virginia or somewhere, and he said, "You'll never know how much we hate you." Yes. And that line never resonated when I first heard it, but boy, does it resonate now. So what was the mood of the South? There were celebrations in the North, but what was the mood of the South upon the surrender and the making of the peace? So.
Yeah, and there, it's impossible to capture it in one mood, right? Because it's the whole spectrum from what I call diehard Confederates. I mean, others had come up with this term, the diehard Confederates who refuses to surrender, and who, when made to surrender, when made to acknowledge that they must surrender, is enraged, right? So that's the person you're talking about. And that quote you give, if I'm right, is sort of right at the same time as the surrender at Appomattox. In other words, so you've got these two generals making peace in the parlor, and then out in the field, you have a Union officer talking to a Confederate officer who says what you just said. The Confederate officer says, you'll never know the kind of rage and that you'll face, and you'll never sort of get us to really surrender. So right there at that moment, you've got the whole spectrum, and they're all, and in the book that I've written, you have all along that spectrum. So you've got people who want peace. You've got Confederate soldiers who just want to go home. They've wanted to go home for a long time, and they're grateful to be able to go home. But then you have people who do not want to surrender. So for the first year, you have the great character of John Mosby. John Mosby is this great and famous raider on the Confederate side, and he refuses to surrender. And he refuses to take off his Confederate uniform, and he shows up in a town and kind of taunts Union soldiers who shoot at him, and he gets away. Mosby ends up coming around rather completely and taking the side of saying, okay, the Confederacy, it's over. We had our run and we lost. But in that moment before, he's completely on board with the idea that the Confederacy won't surrender. Yeah, the rage is great. The rage on both sides. The rage is there. You can find rage on both sides. On the Confederate side, it's the rage of being forced to surrender. On the Union side, it's the rage, especially that follows after the assassination of Lincoln, because there's already this rage against that exists among many Southerners, blaming them for the war. But once Lincoln is assassinated, that's, although we know it to be part of a conspiracy and one key figure plus a bunch of other conspirators, most people thought that, or just made that part of the Confederate war effort, and therefore blamed the entire South for, or the Southern white population for Lincoln's death. So that rage is also going on.
And you have a quote at the end of your book. You're quoting an historian, as Dylan Carroll, calling the early peace the lenient peace. And certainly it was. My always perception from Appomattox, when the soldiers were allowed to keep their sidearms and all that, that there was no overt punishment. So what's your perspective on this lenient peace? Good or bad, or how did that evolve?
Yeah, I'm good or bad, I don't know. And I should sort of signal now that, before this this conversation is over, which, by the way, I'm really enjoying, you're going to ask me about grace. And I want to attach, right, I'll say more about it when you ask, but lenient peace, right? Lenient peace is a kind of grace. And Lincoln and Grant, so Grant at Appomattox, Lincoln more generally, does obviously believe in a lenient peace. In his second inaugural, in Lincoln's second inaugural of early March 1865, he has what's probably the most famous quote from that speech, which is, "With malice toward none." And if you, on the cover of the book is this painting called "The Peacemakers," where Lincoln is speaking to the top commanders. And this is in late March of 65, and he's talking to them about what kind of peace they should arrange, and it's a lenient peace. He says you should let them up easy. That is, let up the conquered people easy. The idea being that Reconstruction will be much easier if we're kind to them now. So that's the idea. Now, you've asked a really good question, which is, yeah, so a lenient peace generally is the way to go. It wasn't so lenient. There were people kept in prison, including Jefferson Davis. There were thoughts to try Jefferson Davis, although it never happened. That effort failed. And there was a trial and execution of a few people, a couple guerrillas. And then most famously, the trial and execution of Henry Wirtz, who's the commandant of Andersonville POW camp in Georgia. That's basically almost a chapter of my book is about that trial and execution of Henry Wirtz. So that's hardly lenient, right?
Yeah.
Wirtz kind of stands in for the hard side of the war, the harsh, non-lenient part. But generally, yeah, the approach is lenient. Was that the right move? Should the U.S. Have been much harder? Certainly, there were Republicans in Congress who did believe that the hard approach should be taken, and they enacted that hard approach. That is, there were occupation policies that enacted this. But what if that hard approach had been really severe and had lasted for hundreds of years, as some thought it had to last? Would things have been different? Could it have been done? We'll never know. We will never know. But I don't think that was going to lead necessarily to a much better answer either. I think a war of occupation, which is what we're talking about, a war of occupation, is just a much harder war in terms of beginning and endings to fight. It's harder to define. It's harder to keep to the boundaries of how to fight it. And it's very hard to say when it's over. So is it over when the troops withdraw, or is it over when the enemy truly, truly has said, okay, we accept your verdict in terms of what the Constitution says, what the country stands for, what have you. And we have come to your position of thinking. Is that when it's over? Because that certainly didn't happen with the Civil War. So defining a war that is a war of occupation is a very, very challenging thing.
Well, toward that end, if we think of lenient peace, so of course, in our hearts, we want to show kindness or aim toward that. But would that kind of leniency and the end of Reconstruction, did that give rise to what was called the lost cause? And in other words, the Southern pride that we didn't really lose the war, it was other external factors. Sentiment that exists today. Do you see a link toward that, or am I inaccurate? So,
well, they're kind of two issues, right? Because the lost cause is quite famous, and that's a way to say we we lost, but we won, right? So yes, we lost the war, but we lost because we simply could never win. We didn't have the manpower, whatever. So that circumstances were such that we had to lose. However, fighting a war when you are against such odds is a noble cause, right? So therefore, the lost cause means we lost, but the cause was noble, and even more noble because others of less character would never have done the fight because the odds were so much against them, right? So we have that kind of strain of lost cause thinking. And yes, it's still alive today. But there's also that strain that not only did we lose, but that the United States Army in the North and the federal government was far too harsh on us, right? So this is a strain that holds up the idea of someone like Sherman being evil for his march across Georgia, and Sherman having burnt the state of Georgia to the ground, which is obviously an exaggeration, or Thaddeus Stevens screaming, we should hang everybody, which is not Stevens's position. So both things are in the Southern memory of the war. And one is, leans towards nobility, but the other hangs on to this notion that the United States did fight a fierce war of occupation beyond or as part of the Civil War. So I'd say both of those are there. So you can, of course, you can go to certain parts of the Union today in the South, but even elsewhere, and find people very angry about the way that the Union behaved. They might even be angry at Lincoln and say that Lincoln was tyrannical in the way he prosecuted the war. It's a minority view, I think, but you can still find it.
Great. Now we are racing toward the end of our show, and as you know, and you already gave a heads up that I'm going to ask you a story about grace. And Professor Vorenberg, share the story about grace and President Lincoln that you want to tell us about. So,
yes, I mean, I think I'll go back to the cover of the book and maybe play this story out a bit, right? So the cover of my book is a painting done from 1868, so 3 years after Appomattox, by a painter whose name is George P.A. Healy. And the painting is called The Peacemakers. And The Peacemakers is meant to represent an actual event, which is a meeting that took place on March 28th, 1865, on board a Union paddle wheel ship, the River Queen. And Lincoln meets with Ulysses Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, David Dixon Porter is the admiral. So it's basically the major commanders of the area, and to discuss surrender. And as I said earlier, his major message is to let them up easy. What he says is let them up easy. And that's a term from wrestling, where the idea is once you've got your victory, both sides sort of know who won, who lost, and you stand up and you basically show grace to the defeated person. You shake hands. You don't laud your victory. You don't rub it in. And what's going to happen in reaction is that the person who's been defeated will respect you. There will be honor among you. Lincoln is drawing this from his experience as a young man on the frontier in Illinois, when this is exactly how he sort of won his way into the hearts of the community, especially the tough guys who were in the community, by wrestling them and behaving this way, beating them, but not just beating them, but then letting them up easy. So grace was always there. And in this painting, the painter captures that, because there's no dialogue in the painting. But the way to capture it is when you look behind Lincoln's shoulder, what do you see, right? You see a rainbow through the window. And the rainbow is meant to convey, right? This, we are moving, or we've arrived at a time of grace, at a time of peace. And so he's conveying Lincoln's words through the image of a rainbow.
What a beautiful story. I did not know the rainbow story, and I'm a great admirer of Lincoln, and he holds lessons for us today. Michael Vorenberg, your book, Lincoln's Peace, is a highly recommended by so many people, and thank you for writing it. How can people find you, sir?
They can find me at michaelvorenberg.com. They can find me. I'm a professor at Brown University. So if they go to the history department website at Brown University, they'll find me there. And I'm on Facebook and Blue Sky and X. And yeah, I'm not much of a user of social media, I confess, but I'm there now. And so you can find me in these ways.
That's okay. And the
I
book
want
is
to thank you, John, very much for having me on and saying nice things about the book. I hope that folks enjoy it, and I really enjoyed writing it.
Well, we have a lot of history fans in this audience, and I know they'll draw lessons from it. So with that, we will exit.